In order to reproduce, you have to survive. So you need to put some kind of resources into survival. But if you put too many resources into survival, you're not going to reproduce as much as your neighbor is. So there's this constant tension that's going on. And one of the consequences of this tension are different what are known as survivorship strategies. And there are three basic types of survivorship strategies, the simplest of which is called the type 2 strategy. In a type 2 strategy, organisms basically have the same likelihood of dying throughout their lifespan. So when they're little, when they're adolescents, when they are, I should say juveniles, when they are reproductive adults, their likelihood of dying is more or less the same. And that's the simplest of survivorship strategies. But there also are strategies where you have a relatively low mortality rate early in life versus later in life, or the converse, where you have a high mortality rate early in life, but a relatively low one later in life. So humans are a good example of these type 1 strategies. Humans have a relatively low death rate early in life, but then we get old and we die. And what that does is it essentially front loads our reproduction. So what organisms with a type 1 survival strategy are good at is basically being highly robust as youngsters or young adults early in their reproductive years. So they make lots of babies, and we have lots of adaptations that make us very good at what we do as youngsters, but as we get old, we become kind of pathetic. And this is because these adaptations that make us quite good in youth at doing what we do, particularly survival and reproduction, potentially make us less good at doing those things later in life. And so we end up with a early life robustness, an early life high amount of reproductive output, your teens and your 20s. And then you're in decline. And then at some point, basically you get really old and your likelihood of dying is quite high compared to, for example, when you're in your teens and 20s. The thing is that we have some potential to die at any time due to accidents. And that means that inherently, there's going to be less individuals that are alive late in life than early in life. And so as a consequence, you want to make sure that you get your reproduction out of the way early in life. And that leads to basically greater abilities early in life than later in life. But not all organisms do that. There are, by contrast, the type 3 organisms. These organisms tend to need to find a location within which they can successfully exploit and reproduce. And finding those locations requires sending out lots and lots and lots of progeny, only a few of which will survive and find a location to exploit. Lobsters. Octopi do this, but perhaps more familiarly, things like oak trees do this. Oak trees make huge numbers of acorns. But if you have a steady state where births equal deaths, it means that on average, a giant oak tree making thousands and thousands and thousands of acorns over its lifetime is going to produce one acorn that survives to produce a new oak tree. So they make lots of progeny, but once they reach an adult stage, like an oak tree, then they can be there and make lots and lots of progeny. They've basically established a territory, a location in which they can gather resources. It's hard to find these locations. They don't open up all the time. But once you find it, it's to your benefit to stick with it as long as you can and make as many progeny as you possibly can. So these guys end up with a high juvenile mortality, Because the job of the juveniles is to do something that's almost impossible to do. So you've got to throw a lot of juveniles at the task in order to have at least one of them survive. But once they've made it into their adulthood, then they're fairly well established and they have a very high potential to make lots and lots of offspring. So you've got a low amount of mortality later in life and a high amount of mortality earlier in life, which contrasts with us, who have a relatively low amount of mortality early in life and a high amount of mortality. We get old and we die later in life. And then there are these organisms that are in between that basically simply die off at a fairly constant rate across their whole lives. That's a very simple survivorship strategy.